The night of August 8th, 1969. Los Angeles was still moving to the familiar rhythm of a city that never sleeps. The Hollywood lights were still shining. Cars were still cruising along the roads, stretching through Beverly Hills, and the parties were still going on. And on the other side of the city, a house on Cielo Drive was sinking into silence. It was a luxurious home, tucked away on a private road high above the Hollywood Hills. Its address was 10050 Cielo Drive, a secluded place, far enough from the public eye for celebrities to escape the attention of the world. But that night, that privacy would become a trap. Inside the house was Sharon Tate. She was only 26 years old, a young actress at the height of her career. Tate had appeared in several films and was quickly becoming one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. But in the summer of 1969, she was more than just a rising movie star. She was also pregnant. Their first child, with director Roman Polanski, was due to arrive soon. The pregnancy was already in its final stage, and the delivery date was fast approaching. Roman Polanski was in Europe at the time, working on a film project, while Sharon Tate remained in Los Angeles. She was staying at the house on Cielo Drive with a few friends. And on the night of August 8th, 4 other people were also there. Jay Sebring, a renowned hairstylist, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer, Abigail Folger, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old young man who had stopped by the house that night. None of them knew that. They had only a few hours left to live. The exact sequence of events that followed has been reconstructed from the testimonies of members of the Manson family, evidence recovered at the scene, and investigative records. But what we do know is that a group of people made their way to Cielo Drive. Among them were Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. According to Kasabian's testimony, they had received instructions from Charles Manson before leaving Span Ranch. Their destination was the house on Cielo Drive. But this is where the story begins to become complicated. Because one of the biggest questions surrounding the entire case is, what did Manson actually know about the house? And what did he want to happen there? That night, Stephen Parent was the first person to encounter the group. He had just left the property in what seemed like a completely random encounter. But only minutes later, Parent was dead. The group then continued into the property. Inside the house, Sharon Tate and her friends had no idea what was happening. There were no alarms, no police, and no neighbors rushing to the scene. Only a group of strangers, slowly making their way toward the house. What happened next became one of the most infamous murders in American history. Sharon Tate was murdered. Jay Sebring was murdered. Abigail Folger was murdered. Wojciech Frykowski was murdered. 4 people inside the house, and Stephen Parent outside. In total, 5 people were dead in a single night. But what made the crime even more horrifying was not simply the number of lives lost. It was the way the killers turned the house into a message. Words written in blood were left at the crime scene. Words like pig, a disturbing sign, a message that seemed not to be meant for the victims, but for whoever would enter the house after them, the police, the press, and the entire nation. The next morning, Los Angeles woke up. But no one knew exactly what had happened on Cielo Drive until a housekeeper entered the property and saw the horrifying scene inside. The police were called, and before long, police cars arrived at the house. Investigators entered and found the bodies, bloodstains, and disturbing clues left behind. But there was one striking detail. There was no obvious connection between the victims and their killers. Sharon Tate was an actress. Jay Sebring was a prominent figure in Hollywood. Abigail Folger came from a wealthy family. Wojciech Frykowski was a foreign national. Stephen Parent was simply a young man who happened to be there that night. On the surface, they seemed to have nothing in common. So why did they all die together? And this is where the story begins to become a mystery. If this was a robbery, why was there no clear evidence that money was the motive? If this was an act of revenge, revenge for what? If Sharon Tate was the target, why did the others have to die as well? And if this was a deliberate killing, what did the perpetrators actually know about the people living in the house? Or was it all simply a random choice? But the police still didn't know one thing. The following night, another Los Angeles family would be murdered. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, two people who were completely unknown to the public. They weren't actors. They weren't producers. They had no connection to Hollywood. They were simply a married couple living an ordinary life. Yet, just 24 hours after the Tate murders, they too became victims. And at the LaBianca crime scene, police once again found disturbing clues that appeared to be connected to the previous night. Once again, words associated with pig appeared at the scene. 2 houses, 2 nights, 7 people dead, and messages that seemed to be written to create a story. At this point, the police began to confront a terrifying possibility. These were not 2 separate crimes. There might be a group of people carrying out deliberate murders, but who were they, and what was their motive? The answer would eventually lead investigators to a place not far from Los Angeles, a rundown ranch known as Span Ranch. It had once been a filming location for Western movies, but by Iju Lilju, it had become home to a strange group of young people who lived apart from mainstream society, used drugs, embraced extreme ideas, and called themselves a family. The Manson family. At the center of this group was a man who did not look like a traditional killer. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a mafia boss. He didn't command an army. He was simply a thin man with long hair, deep-set eyes, and an extraordinary ability to persuade people to believe in things they might never have imagined on their own. His name was Charles Manson. But there is one thing that needs to be made clear. Looking back at the case, more than half a century later, it is easy to turn Manson into an almost supernatural figure. A man who could control other people's minds. A man who could make anyone commit murder with just a few words. But the truth is far more complicated. Because the people who directly took part in the murders were not mindless puppets. They were individuals with their own histories, their own choices, and moments when they could have stopped. And in the end, they still entered those houses. They still carried weapons, and they still killed. That is why the Manson family case should be understood not simply as the story of one manipulator, but also as the story of people who chose to believe in him. And that may be the most important question of the entire case. Was Charles Manson truly the man controlling everything, or was he simply an extremist leader, standing at the center of a group of people who had already gone too far? Was Helter Skelter really the plan behind the murders, or was it a narrative that emerged later? An attempt to explain a series of actions that even those who carried them out could not fully understand. And that may be the most important question of the entire case. Was Charles Manson truly the man controlling everything, or was he simply an extremist leader, standing at the center of a group of people who had already gone too far? Was Helter Skelter really the plan behind the murders, or was it a narrative that emerged later? An attempt to explain a series of actions that even those who carried them out could not fully understand. Charles Manson, the man with nitrogen monoxide power, yet people chose to follow him. Before the name Charles Manson appeared on the front pages of some of America's biggest newspapers, he was not a famous man, not a star, not a political leader, and certainly not a notorious criminal. Manson was simply a man with a deeply troubled past, who had spent much of his life on the margins of ordinary society. But by the late 1960s, he would gather a group of young people around him. People who called him Charlie. People who lived by his words. People who believed what he told them. And eventually, some of them would become killers. The question is, how could a man who had almost nothing in his hands gain so much power over other people? Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His childhood was unstable. Manson grew up in a complicated family and experienced numerous changes throughout his early life. From a young age, he began engaging in criminal behavior, theft, fraud, and repeated stays in juvenile facilities. Instead of building a stable life, Manson became increasingly familiar with a world where the law and society seemed to stand against him. In the years that followed, he continued to commit crimes. He was arrested, sent to prison, released, and then returned again. Prison gradually became a familiar part of Manson's life. But those years also helped him develop a particular skill: reading people. Manson watched. He learned how to talk. He learned how to identify weaknesses. He learned how to make people pay attention. And more importantly, he learned how to make some people feel as though they were truly understood. By the mid-s, America was beginning to change, especially in California. San Francisco had become the center of a new counterculture. Young people began rejecting traditional social norms. They protested against the war. They rejected the values their parents considered normal. They were searching for freedom, searching for love, searching for drugs, and searching for a different way of life. This was the era of the hippie movement. And within that world, Charles Manson found the perfect environment in which to grow his influence. Manson had no exceptional education, no money, no social status, no powerful organization behind him. But he had something many young people were searching for: an answer. Manson talked about love, about freedom, about escaping society. He claimed that the usual rules had no real meaning, that people did not need to live according to the standards imposed by society. And for young people who felt lost or abandoned, those words could be incredibly seductive. One of the first people to become closely connected to Manson was Mary Brunner. She became one of the women closest to him, and later an important member of the group. Then, other young women began to appear: Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and many others. What is particularly striking is that many members of the family were very young. Some came to Manson with unstable lives. Some were searching for freedom. Some had troubled relationships with their families. Some were drawn to the hippie lifestyle. And some simply wanted a place where they felt they belonged. Manson understood that. He did not try to turn them into people like him overnight. Instead, he first made them feel like they belonged to a family. This is where we need to pause. Because if we simply say, Manson was a psychological manipulator, the story becomes far too simple. One person cannot easily control others if those people do not already have some need for belonging, direction, or acceptance. So what kept these young people there? Part of the answer lies in the very idea of the family. Not a family in the traditional sense, but a closed community where Manson was the guide and the other members became brothers and sisters. Old relationships gradually became less important. Parents mattered less. The outside world became them. And inside the family, there was us. This is a mechanism often seen in highly controlling groups, dividing the world into two sides. The people outside do not understand us. The people outside are against us. Only those inside truly understand one another. And as that boundary became clearer, leaving the group became increasingly difficult. But Manson had another tool at his disposal: drugs. LSD and other hallucinogens became part of life within the family. Manson used drugs not simply for pleasure, but tied them to spiritual experiences, to what he described as awakening, and to an entirely different way of seeing the world. And this is important, because when a young person is repeatedly immersed in an environment of drugs, plus sex, plus isolation, plus sleep deprivation, plus extremist beliefs, plus dependence on a leader, their ability to make clear and independent judgments can be seriously affected. But once again, that does not mean every member lost the ability to choose. And this is the crucial moral boundary of the case. Being manipulated does not mean being innocent. By Ijo Lil Bai. The family was becoming increasingly isolated from the outside world. They moved from place to place, lived together, searched for money, searched for food, and eventually they arrived at Span Ranch. It was an old property that had once been used as a filming location for Western movies. There were abandoned structures, wide open spaces, and most importantly, isolation. For Manson, Span Ranch was almost like a world of its own. There was no need to follow the rules of Los Angeles. No need to explain themselves to neighbors. No need to answer uncomfortable questions from their families. The family could live according to their own rules, and Manson could strengthen his influence over them. At Span Ranch, Manson began building something far more dangerous than a hippie group, a belief system. He spoke of the apocalypse, of an approaching war, of black people and white people, of the collapse of America, and of how the family would survive it all. He called the chaos he believed was coming helter-skelter. But the origins of this ideology were not so simple. Manson became obsessed with the music of the Beatles, especially their self-titled album, commonly known as the White Album. He listened to the songs on the album and interpreted them in his own way. To Manson, the music was not simply music. It became evidence, a prophecy, a message meant for him. But here, we need to be especially careful, because the story the public knows today was shaped to a significant extent by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. Bugliosi argued that Manson believed in an apocalyptic race war, that he wanted to trigger that war, and that the murders were part of a plan to create helter-skelter. This theory became central to the prosecution's case. But that does not mean every detail of the theory is an objectively proven fact beyond all doubt. This is where a good documentary must draw a clear distinction between the facts, the testimony, the prosecution's argument, and what we simply cannot know for certain. Because if Manson truly believed that a race war was about to begin, then the next question is, what did he want after the war? According to the world Manson described, the family would survive. They would hide in the desert, and eventually, they would emerge as the dominant force after society collapsed. A new world, a new family, a new order. But those were only words. There is no evidence that Manson actually had a viable plan to build such a world. What he did have was a group of people willing to believe him. And when a leader has a group of followers who believe in him completely, even a delusional idea can become real-world action. Then, one day, Manson began moving from words to action. A past encounter with someone in the music industry, a house on Cielo Drive, an indirect connection to Hollywood, and an address Manson had once known. The pieces were beginning to come together. But did Manson actually want Sharon Tate dead? Or did he simply want his followers to carry out a shocking act? Or perhaps he didn't even know exactly who was inside the house. This remains one of the most important points of debate surrounding the case. Because when we return to the night of August 8, 1969, we will see that Manson did not necessarily have to kill anyone with his own hands to become the center of the case. He only had to convince others that they had to do it. And then, 4 people left Span Ranch. 1 car, 1 address, 1 command. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian. They headed toward Cielo Drive. Manson stayed behind. Hours later, 5 people would be dead. And as the sun rose over Los Angeles, one of the most horrifying murder cases in American history had begun. But before blood appeared on the walls of Cielo Drive, something even more dangerous already existed within the family. Belief. Because a person can refuse an order. But if they believe that order comes from someone with absolute authority, then the question is no longer, who killed them? It becomes, who convinced those people that they had the right to kill? And the answer would take us straight to the fateful night on Cielo Drive, the night Sharon Tate was murdered. Spahn Ranch, a family ORA cult? In 1968, just north of Los Angeles, there was a place that seemed almost cut off from the modern world. It was Spahn Ranch, an old ranch that had once been used as a filming location for Western movies and television shows. Dirt roads, old wooden buildings, horse stables, and a vast, isolated landscape far removed from the rhythm of Los Angeles. To most people, it was simply an aging piece of property. But to Charles Manson, Spahn Ranch would become his kingdom. And for the people who lived there, it would become a world where the rules of the outside world seemed to no longer exist. Manson had no money, no luxurious home, no company, no official organization. But he had something that many powerful people throughout history have possessed. People who believed in him. They called him Charlie. Some members saw him as a father figure. Some regarded him as a spiritual teacher. Others came close to worshiping him. And gradually, a group of young people began living according to the rules Manson created. They became what the press would later call the Manson family. But that raises the question, what exactly was the family? A group of hippies? A communal living group? A cult? Or a criminal group in the making? Perhaps it was all of those things at once. One of the most striking things about the Manson family is the age of many of its members. They were very young. Many came to Manson during periods of instability in their lives. Some had left their families. Some were unhappy with their parents. Some felt that they did not belong in society. Some were drawn to the hippie counterculture. And some simply wanted to find a place where they could feel accepted. Manson understood that need. He did not begin with violence. He began with closeness. He listened to them. He told them that society did not understand them, that their parents did not understand them, that their schools did not understand them, that the law did not understand them. But Charlie understood. For a young person who felt abandoned, that was an incredibly powerful message. And then, Manson began breaking down the old boundaries. Biological families became less important. Old friends became strangers. Social norms were dismissed as artificial. And the family became their new world. Joining the group was not simply about living together. Gradually, they began to change the way they saw themselves. They were no longer a girl who was unhappy with her parents, or a young man who didn't know what he wanted. They became a member of the family. It was a transformation of identity. And when an individual identity becomes absorbed into a collective, the ability to resist its leader can also begin to weaken. Manson was not a leader in the traditional sense. He did not speak to thousands of people from a stage. There was no podium, no office, no army. He used a much simpler method: personal relationships. Manson would often speak privately with individual members. He learned about their fears, their desires, the things they felt were missing from their lives. Then he offered an answer. If someone felt abandoned by their family, Manson became their family. If someone felt oppressed by society, Manson told them that society was something to reject. If someone was searching for freedom, Manson told them that the family was freedom itself. But that freedom came with one condition. You had to listen to Charlie. This is where the story begins to become dangerous. Because a system of control does not necessarily begin with, "You must obey me." It can begin with, "I understand you." Then, "I'm the only one who understands you." Then, "Everyone else is against us." And finally, "Just listen to me." This is how a group of people can gradually lose the ability to see the world from outside the belief system they have built around themselves. Drugs became an important part of life within the family, especially LSD. Hallucinogenic substances were used during spiritual and consciousness-expanding experiences. Manson encouraged his followers to see reality in a different way. But what mattered was not simply the drugs themselves. It was the way Manson connected those experiences to spiritual authority. A psychedelic experience could make someone feel as though they had witnessed something profoundly meaningful. If a leader then told them, "That's exactly what I've been telling you," the personal experience could become evidence supporting the group's belief system. A cycle began to form. Experience gives belief, gives Manson's interpretation, gives stronger belief. And the more they believed, the less they questioned. Manson also used sex as part of life within the family. Relationships did not follow the conventional social norms of the time. Jealousy and possessiveness were reinterpreted. Sexual relationships were presented as a form of liberation from old rules. But behind it all, there was a power structure. Manson was at the center. He decided who stayed close to whom, who was accepted, who was rejected, and who was considered loyal. This created a paradox. The family claimed they were living freely, but in reality, they were becoming increasingly dependent on one man. When the family arrived at Span Ranch, the isolation became even stronger. They no longer had to constantly deal with their families. They did not have to explain their lives to outsiders. They did not have to follow the rules imposed by society. They lived together, ate together, took drugs together, had relationships with one another, listened to Manson, and gradually, the outside world became something foreign to them. This is one of the most important factors in understanding the Manson family. Because when a person lives long enough inside a closed environment, things that were once considered normal on the outside can begin to seem abnormal, and the abnormal things inside can start to feel completely normal. This is an important point to keep in mind when telling the story. The Manson family is often portrayed in popular media as a group of hippies living on drugs and sex. But that was only part of the picture. The family also had to survive. They needed food, money, transportation, shelter, and they had to maintain relationships with people outside the group. One important person in their lives was George Span, the owner of the ranch. Span allowed the group to live there, while Manson and his followers also took on odd jobs around the area. This created an almost ordinary-looking exterior. From the outside, they could have appeared to be nothing more than a group of eccentric young people living on an old ranch. No one immediately saw the dangerous belief system developing inside. Charlie said, "This is one of the most disturbing phrases when looking back at the testimonies of the family members. Not, 'we wanted to do it,' but, Charlie said." Manson gradually became the source of validation for everything. If Charlie said something was right, it was right. If Charlie said something was wrong, perhaps the outside world was the one that was wrong. If Charlie said someone was an enemy, that person became an enemy. And if Charlie said an action was necessary, some members could begin to believe that they had a duty to carry it out. This is where Manson's power became truly dangerous. Not because he had a gun, but because he could make other people pick one up themselves. By the late Ejo Liling S., Manson's ideology was becoming increasingly extreme. He spoke of an approaching war, a war between black people and white people, a period of chaos that would destroy American society. And after everything collapsed, the family would survive. Manson believed they would find a place of refuge. Then, they would become the leaders of the new world. But Manson did not simply talk about the future. He began interpreting events happening around him as evidence that his prophecy was coming true. News of violence, social unrest, protests, racial tensions, all of it could be incorporated into his narrative. This is one of the most dangerous mechanisms of an apocalyptic ideology. Every event can become evidence that proves it. If society was peaceful, it was the calm before the storm. If society was in chaos, it was a sign of the apocalypse. There was no possible outcome that could prove the belief wrong. But was helter-skelter really the plan? This is where we need to ask questions. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi later built much of the case around the idea that Manson wanted to trigger helter-skelter. According to that theory, the murders were part of the plan. The messages left at the crime scenes were connected to that plan, and the family was being used as a tool to create chaos. But when we look more closely, there is a problem. Not every action carried out by the Manson family fits perfectly into one unified plan. There are contradictions, different accounts, personal motives, actions that appear to have been impulsive, and details that, even today, we cannot know for certain what Manson was thinking at every moment. That does not diminish the criminal responsibility of those who were convicted, but it does reveal something important. The history of the Manson family is far more complicated than a simple story about one mastermind and a group of puppets. And then, a name appeared. In Manson's world, Hollywood was always something special. Manson wanted to become a musician. He wanted recognition. He wanted people to hear his music. He wanted to enter a world he had always been excluded from. And through connections in the music industry, Manson once hoped he could turn that dream into reality. But things did not go the way he wanted. Disappointment, a sense of rejection, his obsession with Hollywood, and his apocalyptic ideology began to overlap. Then Manson learned about an address, 10050 Cielo Drive, a house in the Hollywood Hills, a place that had previously been connected to someone in the music industry. And in the summer of 1969, the person living there was Sharon Tate. But there is one crucial point that must be emphasized. There is no basis for simply concluding that Manson knew exactly that Sharon Tate was there and had planned to kill her in advance. The extent of Manson's knowledge about the people inside the house and his precise motives when he gave his instructions remain among the most debated aspects of the case. And that is precisely where the gaps begin, the space where theories emerge. Did Manson want revenge? Did he want to send a message? Did he want to create helter-skelter? Or did he simply want to carry out a murder horrific enough to create chaos? We do know one thing for certain. On the night of August 8th, a group of family members left Span Ranch. They had a car, they had weapons, they had instructions, and they had an address, 10,050 Cielo Drive. Manson did not go with them, but the people who left the ranch carried with them the belief system he had spent years building. Hours later, they would enter Sharon Tate's home, and for the first time, Charles Manson's words would be transformed into blood. Helter-skelter, the war nitrogen monoxide one could see. The summer of 1969. America was standing in the middle of a period of profound unrest. The Vietnam War was still raging. The civil rights movement had transformed American society. Political violence was appearing on television. Protests were taking place in the streets, and racial tensions had not yet disappeared. For many Americans, this was a time of chaos. But to Charles Manson, what was happening was more than chaos. He believed it was a sign that a much larger war was about to begin, a war that would destroy American society. And after everything collapsed, Manson believed that a small group of people loyal to him would survive. That group was the Manson family. A song became a prophecy. To understand Manson, we have to understand one phrase, helter-skelter. The phrase appeared in a song by the Beatles from their 1968 self-titled album, commonly known as the White Album. The song itself was not a call for a race war. It was not written as a political manifesto, but Charles Manson heard it in a completely different way. He believed the music of the Beatles contained messages meant for him. The songs became part of the belief system he was constructing. And gradually, Helter Skelter became the name he gave to an apocalyptic vision. A war, a collapse, an old world being destroyed, and a new world being born. But here, there is an important distinction to make. Helter Skelter was a song, but Charles Manson's Helter Skelter was an ideology. The two were not the same. Manson took what he believed he heard in the music and placed it within his own belief system. It was an extreme interpretation, and from that point on, music was no longer simply music. It became evidence. Was the world collapsing? Manson looked at America in the late 1960s and saw a society standing on the edge of collapse. Protests, violence, racial tensions, the Vietnam War, the assassinations of political figures, all of these events became raw material for his narrative. According to Manson, the existing social order could not survive much longer. A major racial conflict would erupt. Black Americans would rise up. White Americans would be drawn into the violence. Cities would descend into chaos. The government would lose control. And, eventually, America would collapse. But Manson did not see himself as a victim of that future. He saw himself as the one who would emerge victorious. And where would the family go? According to the story Manson told his followers, the family would escape the coming war. They would leave the outside world behind, hide somewhere far away. At one point, Manson directed the family toward the desert. He believed they would wait there until the conflict was over. When the old world collapsed, the family would emerge, and they would become the leaders of the new world. It sounds irrational, but that is precisely the point. An apocalyptic ideology does not have to be logical. It only has to be powerful enough to make those who believe in it stop believing in the world outside. Who was Charlie in that world? In Manson's version of reality, he was not simply an ordinary man. He was the one who understood what others could not. He knew the future. He knew what was coming. He knew how to survive. And most importantly, he knew what the family had to do. This is where Manson's power became truly frightening. Because if someone believes their leader can see the future, then any command can be transformed into part of a greater plan. It is no longer, Charlie wants me to do this. It becomes, Charlie knows this has to happen. The difference between those two statements is the distance between a leader and someone regarded as a prophet. But did Manson really believe? This is one of the most difficult questions. Did Charles Manson genuinely believe in Helter Skelter, or was he simply saying those things to control the family? We cannot look inside Manson's mind. There is no single document that can prove exactly what he believed at every point in time. What we have are testimonies, interviews, accounts from former members, and statements Manson made during and after the trial. And all of these sources do not always agree completely. It is possible that Manson genuinely believed in the apocalyptic world he described. Perhaps he believed some of it and exaggerated the rest. Or perhaps he realized that these stories had an extraordinary influence on the people living around him, and simply continued using them. Helter Skelter and violence. According to prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi's argument at trial, Manson wanted to create Helter Skelter. The murders were presented as part of that plan. The messages left at the crime scenes were also interpreted as part of an effort to create chaos. But this is where we need to separate evidence from explanation. The evidence shows that members of the Manson family carried out the murders. The evidence also established Manson's involvement with the group. and he was convicted for his role in the crimes. But proving that a particular ideology was the sole motive is far more complicated, and that remains one of the major debates when looking back at the case. YPIG. After the murders at Cielo Drive, the killers left words written in blood. One of them was, "Pig," and, at the La Bianca crime scene the following night, similar messages appeared again. On the surface, this seemed to reinforce the helter-skelter theory. But consider another question. If the goal was to trigger a race war, why were those messages necessary? If the intention was to create chaos, why leave a message behind? If the objective was simply to kill, why turn the crime scene into a stage? Perhaps the answer is this. Manson wanted people to see the message. Not just the victims, not just the police, but society as a whole. Murder or the creation of a story. This is a particularly important point. A murder can end when the killer leaves the crime scene. But when the killer leaves behind a message, the crime continues to exist. The police have to interpret it. The media have to report it. The public begins to speculate, and fear starts to spread. If that was Manson's goal, then he did not simply want to kill. He wanted to communicate through violence. This was a form of psychological terror, not necessarily in the legal sense, but in the social sense. A house was turned into a message. A victim was turned into a symbol. A line written in blood became a headline, and a group of otherwise unknown people became a name that an entire country would begin to fear. But there was a problem. If Helter Skelter was truly a plan Manson had carefully constructed, why was the plan so chaotic? Why were the targets unclear? Why were the victims so different? Why did the methods of carrying out the crimes vary? And why did the family members themselves give different accounts of Manson's role? These are questions that cannot be ignored. Because if we simply tell the story as Manson wanted to create Helter Skelter, so he ordered the murders, we turn an extraordinarily complex case into a story that is far too simple. The truth may have been more complicated. Manson may have had an idea. He may have wanted to create chaos. But the people who actually carried out the violence may have interpreted his words in their own ways. Perhaps they wanted to please him. Perhaps they truly believed in Helter Skelter. Perhaps they wanted to prove their loyalty. Or perhaps all of these factors existed at the same time. The people who believed. That is the most frightening part. It was not simply what Manson said. It was that other people believed him. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Charles Tex Watson. These people did not merely hear the story of Helter Skelter. They lived inside it. They heard Manson repeatedly speak about the future. They lived in an environment where the outside world was portrayed as something hostile. They used drugs. They lived in isolation. They depended on the family. And Manson became the center of their world. Eventually, the line between Manson said something and that something must be true may have disappeared. A world where right and wrong nitrogen monoxide longer existed. That is how an extremist belief system can grow. If Charlie said society was evil, then society was evil. If Charlie said someone was an enemy, then that person became an enemy. If Charlie said an action was necessary, it became a duty. And if Charlie said a war was coming, then every sign in the world could be interpreted through that lens. A police car driving past? It could be a sign. A protest on Television? It could be a sign. A Beatles song? It could be a sign. A news report about violence? Another sign? Everything could be absorbed into the story. And once someone truly believed they were living in an apocalyptic world, violence could begin to look like something necessary. But what about Sharon Tate? This is where the entire theory begins to encounter a major problem. Who was Sharon Tate? In the story of Helter Skelter, she was not a political leader. She was not a central figure in the civil rights movement. She had no obvious connection to a racial conflict. She was simply a young actress who was pregnant. So why her? Why Cielo Drive? Why the people who happened to be there that night? And why kill all of them if Manson knew exactly that Sharon Tate was inside the house? That could tell one story. But if he did not know, then everything looks very different. A random choice? An old address? An act of revenge? Or an order that the people carrying it out interpreted in their own way? This is the darkness we have to enter. Because as night fell on August 8th, 1969, Manson did not need to hold the knife himself. He did not need to appear at Cielo Drive. He only needed other people to believe that. They knew what they had to do. And they went. That night, a car left Spahn Ranch. Inside were members of the family. They carried weapons. They carried the words Manson had spoken. And they carried an address, 10,050 Cielo Drive. A house where Sharon Tate was staying. A house where no one inside knew that. They had become the targets of a group of people they had never met. Hours later, Stephen Parent would be dead. Sharon Tate would be dead. Jay Sebring would be dead. Abigail Folger would be dead. Wojciech Frykowski would be dead. And one of the most horrifying criminal cases in American history would begin. But what makes that night so haunting is not only what happened inside the house. It is the question, what exactly did Manson say before they left? What did he want them to do? And did he know who was inside the house? The answers lie in the testimony of those who were there, and especially in the account of Linda Kasabian. Cielo Drive, the night Sharon Tate was murdered. August 8th, 1969. Los Angeles was still awake. But along the roads leading into the Hollywood Hills, everything became quieter. Houses stood behind gates and fences. Private roads wound through the hills. The lights of the city glowed in the distance, and along one of those roads, there was a house with the address 10050 Cielo Drive. No one inside knew that. Within just a few hours, this place would become the scene of one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. A mother waiting for her first child. Sharon Tate was 26 years old at the time. She was pregnant, and her first child with director Roman Polanski was expected to be born soon. Polanski was in Europe, while Tate remained in Los Angeles, spending her time with friends. There was no indication that she knew she was in danger. She was not a political figure. She was not involved with any gang. She had no conflict with the people who were about to arrive at her home. And that is precisely what makes the case so difficult to understand. Why Sharon Tate? That night, there were also several other people inside the house. Jay Sebring, a famous hairstylist, and Tate's former romantic partner, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger family fortune, and Frykowski's girlfriend, and a young man named Stephen Parent. Parent did not live there. He had simply stopped by the house that night. A brief visit, a conversation, just a few minutes. No one knew that. The final minutes of Parent's life were already approaching. At Spahn Ranch, not far away, a group of people was preparing to leave Spahn Ranch. Among them were Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. They traveled together, but Linda Kasabian was different from the other three in one crucial way. She did not directly take part in the killings. Later, Kasabian would become a key witness for the prosecution. Her testimony would help investigators reconstruct much of what happened that night. But before the group left, there was a meeting with Charles Manson. According to Kasabian's testimony, Manson directed the group to the house on Cielo Drive. This is one of the most important points in the entire case, because if her account was accurate, Manson had played a directing role before the massacre took place. But one question still remains. Did Manson know that Sharon Tate was inside? This is something we have to be extremely careful about when telling the story. Knowing the address does not necessarily mean that Manson knew exactly who was inside the house that night. And the extent of what Manson actually knew became one of the most debated aspects of the case. The car headed up Cielo Drive. As the night grew deeper, the car made its way up the road. The air was quiet. Wealthy homes stood behind fences and gates. And ahead was the gate to 10,050 Cielo Drive. The group approached the property, but they did not immediately enter the house. Testimony indicates that the group had to find a way onto the property. And then Stephen Perrin appeared. Stephen Perrin. Perrin was only 18 years old, a young man who had just left the guest house on the property. No one knows exactly what was said during the final moments of his life. But one thing is certain. He encountered the group. And that encounter ended in his death. Perrin became the first victim of that night. A person who had absolutely no connection to Manson's world. He was not the primary target. He was not famous. He had no history of conflict with the family. He was simply a young man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The door opens after Perrin was killed. The group continued into the property. Inside, Sharon Tate and her friends still had no idea what was happening. There was no opportunity to prepare, no warning, no time to call the police. The intruders had made their way onto the property, and from this point on, everything unfolded within a very short period of time. According to testimony presented during the investigation and trial, Tex Watson played the primary role in carrying out the attack. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and others also participated. But the precise details of what each person did, who did what, and when, became subjects of dispute across different accounts. Not everyone involved told the story in exactly the same way. This is important, because a case can have a legal truth while still containing historical gaps. Sharon Tate was nearly full term in her pregnancy. She was only 26 years old and was at home with her friends. According to the case records, Tate was murdered along with Sebring, Frykowski, and Folger. Her death became the most widely remembered part of the entire Manson case. Not simply because Tate was a well-known actress, but because of who she was at that moment, a young woman nearing the end of her pregnancy. That image would become one of the most enduring symbols of the brutality of the crime. But there is something we need to remember. For decades, the media often told the story as though Sharon Tate had been a specific target. A Hollywood actress, a pregnant woman, a young star. But the historical evidence does not allow us to simply conclude that Manson planned to kill Tate because of who she was. This is one of the points where we need to remain careful. Why was that house chosen? That is the question. And the answer is not entirely clear. If Tate was the target, then why did Jay Sebring have to die? Why Abigail Folger? Why Wojciech Frykowski? And why Stephen Perrin? If this was a deliberate assassination, the number of victims seems far too large. But if this was a random killing, then why did the group go to that particular house? That is the paradox at the heart of the case. Was there a specific target? Or was there no target at all? After the victims were killed, the perpetrators left words written at the crime scene. One of the most famous was pig, a single, short word, but it would become one of the most enduring symbols of the case. The following morning, when police entered the house, they did not see only the bodies. They also saw a message that seemed to say to whoever walked through that door, "Look at what we have done." And this is where the case became more than just a murder. A killer might want to conceal a crime, but here, the perpetrators seemed to do the opposite. They left signs behind. They turned the crime scene into a message, and once that message was discovered, it would spread across Los Angeles, and then across the entire United States. The morning of August 9, the sun rose, and Los Angeles woke up. But at Cielo Drive, a tragedy had already unfolded. Police were called to the scene, and investigators entered the property. What they saw did not look like an ordinary burglary, a typical robbery, or a conventional act of revenge. There were too many victims. There were strange signs. There were messages left behind. And most importantly, there was no obvious perpetrator. Sharon Tate's name immediately appeared in newspapers. Hollywood was shaken. A young actress, pregnant, murdered inside her own home. The public wanted to know who had done this and why. But at that moment, the police still had no answers. There was one detail that made the case even more terrifying. That night, not everyone in the area knew what had happened. Life around them continued as normal. People in nearby houses were still asleep. The streets remained quiet. Hollywood was still lit up. No one knew that, just a short distance away, a group of people had just carried out a massacre, and they were still free. But if everything had ended at Cielo Drive, the case might have remained a horrifying but isolated murder. It would not have become the Manson legend, because just one night later, another family would be murdered. Leno LaBianca, Rosemary LaBianca, two people who were not actors, not celebrities, with no obvious connection to Sharon Tate. So why them? The night of August 9th passed. Police were still trying to understand what had happened, but they did not know that the killers were not finished. The following day, Charles Manson would once again enter the story, and another group of family members would set out. This time, the target was not a Hollywood star, not a house on Cielo Drive, but an ordinary married couple living on Waverly Drive. And when police entered the LaBianca home, they would see something familiar. Words, signs, messages. This time, they would force investigators to ask a terrifying question. Could the two crime scenes really have been connected to the same group of people? And if so, this was no longer just a murder. This was a campaign that Charles Manson may have been behind. But the most important questions remained. What did Manson really want? Was Helter Skelter truly the objective? Or was everything that happened the result of a combination of extremist beliefs, blind loyalty, and uncontrolled violence? The answer would lie in the second night. The words on the walls. The morning of August 9th, 1969. Los Angeles woke up to a story that only a few hours earlier seemed impossible. A young actress, a house in the hills, 4 other people dead alongside her, and strange words appearing inside the crime scene. Police still did not know who was behind the killings, but the perpetrators had left something behind. Not a fingerprint, not a name, not an address, but a message. The word pig was written in blood at the Cielo Drive crime scene. A very short word, but in the context of 1969, it carried a particular meaning. Pig was a term commonly used by counterculture groups to refer to police or figures of authority. And Charles Manson had built a worldview in which the outside world was the enemy. The police were the enemy. The law was the enemy. Traditional values were the enemy. And the people who followed those rules could all be seen as part of the system Manson despised. So, the word on the wall was not simply a word. It could have been a signal, a taunt, or part of an ideology. But, do we really know what it meant to the person who wrote it? What did the police see? Imagine investigators entering the house that morning. The atmosphere was heavy. Rooms had been disturbed. There were bodies, blood, and words written at the scene. There was no suspect waiting for the police, no confession, no security camera capturing the killers' faces, No obvious motive, only a crime scene, and a series of questions. Who had done this? Why? And why would they want to leave a message behind? If the goal had been simply to kill, the perpetrators could have left the scene without writing anything. But they did not. That could point to one of three possibilities. First, they wanted to create fear, not simply to kill, but to make sure that those who came afterward would know this was a deliberate act. Second, they wanted to create a symbol, a sign that others might recognize. Third, the message was genuinely connected to Manson's ideology. If so, Cielo Drive was not simply the scene of a murder. It was a stage. But there was a problem. If we know that the Manson family was involved, it becomes very easy to view everything through the lens of Manson. Pig becomes helter-skelter. The words become part of a larger plan. The victims become deliberate targets. Every detail is fitted into a single narrative. But criminal investigations should not work that way. A theory only becomes meaningful when independent evidence supports it. And, on the morning of August 9th, the police did not have those pieces yet. They had only a crime scene. August 9. Los Angeles was still trying to understand what had happened at Cielo Drive. But while the media focused on Sharon Tate, the Manson family was still active. And by that evening, another group of people set out. This time, Charles Manson himself would become part of the events. The new destination was a house on Waverly Drive, where Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were living. Two people with nitrogen monoxide connection to Hollywood. Leno LaBianca, a middle-aged man. Rosemary LaBianca, his wife. Their lives appeared to have no connection whatsoever to the world of Sharon Tate. No Hollywood. No fame. No public controversies. No obvious reason for them to become targets. And that is precisely what made the case so frightening. If the Manson family wanted to attack Hollywood, why kill an ordinary married couple? If the goal was to trigger a race war, why choose them? And if this was revenge, what had they done? No one knew. The LaBianca night. The group arrived at the LaBianca home. Manson was present at one point during the events. He helped restrain the couple. Then, Manson left the house. The other members remained behind, and the killings took place. Leno LaBianca was killed. Rosemary LaBianca was killed. Once again, the perpetrators did not stop at murder. They left messages behind. And this time, police saw words that sent a chill through them. Death to pigs. Helter-skelter. A misspelling of helter-skelter. The words appeared at the LaBianca crime scene. And now, one question seemed almost impossible to avoid. Were the two murders connected? Cielo Drive, Waverly Drive, 2 houses, 2 consecutive nights, 7 people dead, and messages connected by the word pig. This time, the coincidence was becoming too significant to ignore. If Cielo Drive had been an isolated crime, the LaBianca murders changed everything. Police now had reason to believe that the same group of people could be behind both killings. But was helter-skelter actually evidence? This is where we need to be careful. A message reading helter-skelter at the crime scene clearly fits the ideology that prosecutors would later associate with Manson, but it does not automatically prove that Manson planned the murders to trigger helter-skelter. It only shows that whoever wrote the words wanted to leave behind a message connected to that phrase. Who wrote it? Why? What did they believe it meant? And were they actually carrying out Manson's intentions? Those are different questions. Bugliosi and the helter-skelter theory. After the case went to trial, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi built a powerful theory. According to Bugliosi, Manson believed that a race war was coming. He wanted to accelerate that conflict. The family members would carry out the killings. The crime scenes would be staged to make investigators believe that black perpetrators were responsible. From there, America would descend into chaos. And when the war was over, Manson and the family would emerge. This became widely known as the helter-skelter theory. It became one of the most famous explanations for Manson's motive. But being famous does not mean it is beyond debate. A theory that explains everything? One of the dangers of analyzing a historical case is finding a theory that is simply too compelling. Once we accept that theory, every piece of evidence can be interpreted through it. Cielo Drive? Helter-skelter? La Bianca? Helter-skelter. Pig? Helter-skelter. Death to pigs? Helter-skelter. Helter-skelter. Clearly, helter-skelter. But a real investigation has to ask a harder question. Is there any evidence that does not fit the theory? That is the question that truly matters. The Manson family was not a highly organized institution. There was no official membership list, no formal hierarchy, no written record of orders, no documented war plan. Much of what we know about Manson's ideology comes from the accounts of former members, witness testimony, interviews, and evidence presented in court. That means some parts of the story are well established, but other parts depend heavily on the accounts of people who were inside the family. And the most important person among the people who had been close to Manson, one woman would play a decisive role. Her name was Linda Kasabian. Kasabian had gone with the group to Cielo Drive. She witnessed what happened before and during that night, but she did not directly participate in the killings. After leaving the family, Kasabian decided to cooperate with police, and that changed the investigation completely. For the first time, investigators had someone from inside the group, someone who could tell them what Manson had said, where the group had gone, who was present, who had done what, and what had happened during those nights of murder. But there was a problem. Linda Kasabian was not an investigator. She was a member of the family. She was also connected to the events, and in exchange for her cooperation, she received immunity from prosecution. That made her testimony extremely valuable. But it also raised an important question. How much can we trust the testimony of someone who benefits legally from what they say? This would become one of the biggest battles of the trial. The prosecution argued that Kasabian was a crucial witness and that her testimony was consistent with other evidence. But the defense could ask, was she recounting everything accurately? Was she minimizing her own role? Did she have a motive to shift responsibility onto Manson and the others? That is why Kasabian's testimony would become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. The words that could not be erased. Back to Cielo Drive. The words, written in blood, had dried, but they had already served their purpose. They made the crime scene even more terrifying. They forced investigators to search for a meaning. And when the two crime scenes were placed side by side, a story began to take shape. A group of people, a leader, an ideology, a series of murders, and one name, the Manson family. But there was a paradox. The more investigators focused on the messages, the more their attention turned toward Manson. But the more they focused on Manson, the more they had to prove that he was actually connected to the murders. It was not enough to say, Manson had bizarre beliefs. It was not enough to say, the family lived at Spawn Ranch. It was not enough to say, the members believed in him. Investigators had to establish who gave the orders, who carried out the killings, who knew what in advance, who was present, who said what, and most importantly, what role did Manson actually play? That was when the investigation entered a new phase. From the crime scenes to the people. From the words on the walls to the testimonies. And from those testimonies, investigators began moving towards Spawn Ranch. But the irony was, the Manson family had already crossed paths with law enforcement several times before the Tate LaBianca case was solved. They had attracted attention. They had been arrested in connection with other incidents. They had been living almost in plain sight. But no one knew that inside that group were people who had just carried out one of the most shocking series of murders in American history. And then, a new question emerged. If police had already been so close to the Manson family, why hadn't they discovered the truth sooner? Were there warning signs they had overlooked? Could other crimes have been connected to the family? And most importantly, how could a group of people living near Los Angeles disappear from the police radar, even after 7 people had been murdered? The answers would lead investigators back to Span Ranch, the place where police would finally begin to see what was really happening inside the Manson family. What did the police miss? After 2 nights, 7 people were dead. 2 houses, 2 crime scenes, strange words written in blood, and a name was beginning to surface in the investigation: Charles Manson. But at that point, Los Angeles police still could not prove that this man was behind the murders. Manson had not been found at Cielo Drive. He had not left any clear fingerprints at the crime scenes. There was no document signed, "Charles Manson gave the order," no written plan. And so, the most important question now became, how could police connect a man living at Span Ranch to 7 deaths in Los Angeles? The answer is yes. Manson was not a complete stranger to law enforcement. He had a criminal history stretching back many years, including theft, fraud, vehicle-related offenses, drug offenses, and multiple periods of incarceration. In other words, Charles Manson had been familiar with the criminal justice system long before the summer of 1969. But there was a paradox. A person with a long criminal record is not automatically someone capable of commanding a group of killers. And there was no obvious reason for police to immediately think, this is the man behind the Sharon Tate murders. After the crime scene was examined, police had plenty of questions, but they were missing a motive. Sharon Tate had no obvious feud with a criminal group. Neither did Jay Sebring. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski had no apparent reason to become the targets of a massacre. Stephen Parent did not even live there. The crime seemed to make no sense, and that made finding the killer even more difficult. Then came the LaBianca murders. 2 completely different victims. They were not celebrities. They were not part of the Hollywood world. But the crime scene contained similar signs: pig, death to pigs, and most notably, helter-skelter, a misspelled word, but one so distinctive that it was difficult to simply dismiss. Now, police had reason to believe that the 2 cases were connected. This was a crucial question, because if the writer was a member of the Manson family, those words could help connect the group to the murders. But if they were not, the entire theory might have to be reconsidered. And to answer that question, police needed to find the people who had been close to the suspects, people who had lived with the family, people who had seen Manson, people who had heard him speak, and eventually, investigators began making their way towards Span Ranch. Span Ranch under police watch. Span Ranch was not a completely secret place. People knew that a group of young men and women were living there. Some had seen them. Some of their activities had attracted the attention of local residents, and the Manson family had already had several encounters with law enforcement. But no one could immediately see the entire picture. A group of young people living together did not automatically mean a criminal organization. People using drugs were not automatically killers, and a man talking about the apocalypse did not automatically mean he was planning a massacre. That was why police could not simply arrest Manson because of his bizarre beliefs. They needed evidence. Throughout the entire case, perhaps no other person would become more important to the prosecution than Linda Kasabian. Kasabian had lived with the family. She knew Manson. She knew the other members, and she understood how the group operated. Most importantly, she had gone with the group on the night of the Cielo Drive murders. But afterward, Kasabian left the family and decided to cooperate with authorities. For investigators, it was almost like a breakthrough. They no longer had to rely entirely on speculation. They had someone from the inside. Someone who could tell them what had happened. This is an important point. Kasabian was not a complete outsider. She had been there. She had accompanied the group to Cielo Drive. She knew the people involved in the killings. And she also faced the possibility of prosecution. By cooperating with the prosecution, she was able to avoid being convicted for her role in the events. That made her testimony both extremely valuable and something that had to be examined carefully. Because a witness who benefits from a legal agreement is always a witness the defense can challenge. Kasabian said that Manson was at the center of the family and held enormous influence over its members. In the days leading up to the murders, she said, Manson had given instructions. On the night of the Cielo Drive killings, Kasabian went with the group, but did not directly participate in the murders. She remained near the scene and later witnessed what happened. The following day, she was again present during the trip to the LaBianca home. Her testimony allowed the prosecution to construct a chain of events. Manson gave the instructions. The family moved. The members carried out the killings. And afterward, they returned to Span Ranch. If that account was accurate, Manson did not need to personally kill anyone. He only needed to give the orders. Did Manson actually order the killings? Or did he simply say things in vague terms and allow the members to interpret them for themselves? That is a very important distinction, because "I want them dead" is completely different from "bring about helter-skelter." One is a direct order, the other is an ideology. And between an ideology and an act of violence, there can be a very large gap. Point of doubt. Xing Haoyi. Who actually gave the orders? For many years, the popular narrative portrayed Manson as the mastermind sitting behind the scenes. He spoke, others acted. But when we look more closely, the testimonies were not always completely consistent about what Manson actually said. Some details were remembered differently. Some statements were given after significant periods of time. Some witnesses had been under the influence of drugs. Others had reasons to minimize their own roles. And some accounts changed over time. That does not mean the testimony was false. But it does mean we have to distinguish between what has been proven and what has been told. Point of doubt. Xing Hall R. Did Manson want Sharon Tate dead? This may be the most famous question of all. Did Manson know that Sharon Tate was staying at Cielo Drive? Did he actually want her dead? Or was the address chosen for another reason? There had been an earlier connection between Manson and the music industry. The Cielo Drive property had previously been associated with music producer Terry Melcher, who had met Manson. Manson had hoped that Melcher would help advance his music career, but the relationship did not develop as he had hoped. The problem was, Melcher had moved out before the murders. Sharon Tate and the others were the ones living there. So if Manson wanted revenge against Melcher, why did the other people have to die? That is one of the questions that makes the Hollywood revenge theory far more complicated. Point of doubt. Xing Halsen. Why the LaBianca home? If Cielo Drive was connected to Hollywood, then the LaBianca home is even harder to explain. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were not celebrities. There is no clear evidence that they were personally targeted by Manson. So why them? One theory suggests that the LaBianca murders were carried out to create even more chaos. If that was the objective, it would fit the helter-skelter narrative. But there is another possibility. Manson may have selected the location, while the others turned it into a killing in their own way. And that makes the role of each individual member even more important. Point of doubt. Xing Hao Si. The written messages. Pig. Death to pigs. Helter-skelter. These words appeared to connect the crimes. But who decided to write them? Who actually wrote them? And why was helter-skelter misspelled? Was it simply a spelling mistake? Or did it reflect the way the writer understood the phrase? No one can know for certain from a few words alone. But for the prosecution, they became an extremely important piece of the puzzle. Point of doubt. Xing Hao Wu. Was Manson the only person with power? This is a point that is often overlooked. Manson was the leader, but the members of the family were not robots. Tex Watson carried out much of the violence at Cielo Drive. Susan Atkins participated. Patricia Krenwinkel participated. Linda Kasabian was present, and each of them had their own thoughts, motives, and varying degrees of loyalty to Manson. That means the case may not have been as simple as Manson gave the orders, gives everyone obeyed. It may have been more complicated. Manson created an ideological world, gives the members, came to believe in that world, gives, and then they turned his words into action themselves. If that was the case, Manson's responsibility was still enormous. But the mechanism that led to the murders may have been far more complex. As the investigation progressed, police finally had more reason to focus their attention on the family. Span Ranch became a critical location. But what made the situation so unusual was that the Manson family did not resemble a traditional criminal organization. There was no office, no records, no accounting books, and no stamped plans. Just a group of people living together, and one man at the center of it all, Charles Manson. As police began closing in on the group, Manson still did not resemble the image of a master criminal. He did not look like a crime boss. He did not wear a suit. He did not control an empire. He did not have dozens of armed men protecting him. He was simply a thin man, with long hair, standing among a group of young people. But perhaps it was that very appearance of normality that made him even more dangerous. An interesting detail. Before being arrested for the murders, Manson and members of the family had already been taken into custody during a raid involving a vehicle and other issues. But afterward, they were released because of procedural problems and an incorrect location. This created a crucial window of time, because at that moment, authorities had the Manson family in their hands, but they did not yet know what they were dealing with. After that, the investigation continued, and piece by piece, the puzzle began to come together. A hippie group, or a killing machine. This was the moment the image of the Manson family changed completely. Before that, they might have been seen as nothing more than an eccentric group of hippies. Afterward, they became the Manson family, a name that would strike fear into the public. But what is interesting is that the media also played a major role in creating that image. Long hair, old clothes, drugs, the desert, sex, a leader with an intense, intimidating gaze. All of it helped create the image of a murderous cult, and that image has survived to this day. But the historical reality was far more complicated. Another question began to emerge. If the Manson family was truly responsible for the Cielo Drive and La Bianca murders, could they have been connected to other crimes as well? Missing persons, unexplained deaths, unsolved murders. In the years that followed, numerous theories attempted to link the Manson family to other cases. Some had a factual basis. Some were extremely weak, and some were little more than legend. This is where we need to avoid a dangerous trap. Not every mysterious crime that happened in California in 1969 was a Manson case. But there are a few cases, strange enough to keep researchers asking questions. Someone from inside begins to talk. In the end, what police needed most was not a fingerprint, not a weapon, not another message, but a confession from someone on the inside. And when Susan Atkins began talking to other inmates, a crucial chain of events was set in motion. What she revealed connected the Manson family to Cielo Drive, connected them to the La Bianca murders, and ultimately helped lead investigators to Manson. But Atkins's testimony also raised a new problem. When someone is facing the death penalty, their testimony can be influenced by many things. Fear, the desire to survive, the desire to reduce their own responsibility, or even the desire to retaliate against others. So investigators had to examine every detail carefully. And as they did, a picture began to emerge. A picture in which Charles Manson did not need to kill anyone himself, but may have created an environment in which other people were willing to kill for him. And then police had enough evidence. Manson was arrested. Other members of the family were arrested as well. The investigation entered a new phase. But this was only the beginning, because catching a suspect does not mean proving guilt. The prosecution had to answer one central question. Was Manson the one giving the orders? Or was he simply a man who said bizarre and disturbing things, while others independently chose to commit the murders? This would become the central battle of the trial. One side argued Manson was the mastermind. The other could argue the people who committed the killings were responsible for their own actions. And between those two arguments stood a series of conflicting testimonies. But before the trial began, police still had one thing they needed to understand. Who was Charles Manson really? A psychopath? A cult leader? A manipulator? A man who genuinely believed the things he said? Or all of those things at once? Because to convict a person, the law requires evidence. But to understand a person, sometimes you have to look at their entire life. And the story of Charles Manson began long before CeeLo Drive. Charles Manson. Did his past create the monster? Before Charles Manson became a name that terrified an entire country, he was once just a child. A child born into chaos. A young man who repeatedly broke the law. A man who spent much of his early life in reform schools, juvenile facilities, and prisons. And then, one day, he walked out of prison and into 1960s California. A society undergoing enormous change. A generation of young people rebelling against traditional values. A place where people who felt abandoned by society could find one another. And Charles Manson found the people who would come to call him Charlie. But the question remains, did Manson become that person because of his past? Or did he already possess dangerous traits from an early age? Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His childhood was far from that of a typical American family. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was very young when she gave birth to Charles. Family life was unstable. Manson did not grow up in an environment with consistent care and supervision. The relationships within his family changed. The adults around him changed. And while he was still a child, Manson began to encounter delinquent behavior. This does not mean that a troubled childhood creates a killer. That would be far too simplistic. Millions of people grow up in poverty, experience neglect, or endure unstable childhoods, yet never become violent criminals. So, Manson's past may help us understand part of who he became, but it can never be an excuse. Years spent in reform schools and juvenile facilities. Manson began committing crimes when he was very young. He became involved in theft and other delinquent behavior. When he was arrested, he was sent to juvenile correctional facilities. And what is striking is that Manson spent a significant portion of his youth within the correctional system. There, he may have learned an important lesson. People can be controlled through fear. But he may also have learned the opposite. People can control others by understanding their fears. Manson was not highly educated. He had no stable career, no wealth, no social status. But he had an ability to observe people. He knew when to remain silent, when to speak, when to appear friendly, and when to make others feel afraid. That would become one of his most powerful weapons. Not a gun, not a knife, but language. Prison became Manson's school. For years, Manson repeatedly cycled in and out of prison. Each time, he returned to society. He tried to build a new life, but those attempts often failed. He continued committing crimes, continued getting arrested, continued returning to prison. A pattern began to form. Freedom gives crime, gives prison, gives release, gives crime. And, with each cycle, Manson became increasingly detached from ordinary society. But prison gave him something else as well. Time. Time to observe, read, think, learn how to communicate, and, most importantly, construct a new image of himself. Manson became interested in music, religion, psychology, and ideas about freedom. Later, he would combine these influences into a system of beliefs that became uniquely his own. This was a turning point. Manson was released from prison in 1967 at a time when America was changing rapidly. San Francisco had become a center of the counterculture movement, drawing young people searching for freedom, love, music, drugs, and a life different from that of their parents' generation. And Manson arrived at exactly the right moment. He did not need to create the hippie movement. The movement already existed. Manson only needed to find a way into it. And he quickly realized one thing. Many young people were searching for someone who could give them answers. Manson never said, "I will become your leader." He did not need to. He began by making people feel understood. A young woman felt abandoned by her family. Manson told her that her real family was here. Someone felt that society was fake. Manson told them that society was the problem. Someone wanted to escape the rules. Manson told them they could live freely. But that freedom gradually became tied to dependence. This was one of the most disturbing aspects of the Manson family. Manson did not begin with violence. He began with love, or at least with the feeling of being loved. He called the members his family and created a community where they lived together, shared with one another, had relationships, used drugs, sang songs, played music, and wandered from place to place. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing more than a hippie community. But inside, power was gradually becoming concentrated in one person, Charlie. A member might begin by thinking, "Charlie is the person who understands me." Then, Charlie understands the world. Then, Charlie knows the future. And finally, Charlie knows what I must do. That is how a leader can gradually become someone with almost absolute power over those who follow him. Manson and the psychology of isolation. A person is much harder to control when they have no outside perspective. At Span Ranch, the Manson family lived within a closed system of information. Manson spoke. The family listened. The family believed. And then, they reinforced those beliefs among themselves. That isolation made Manson's influence far more powerful. Drugs and the alteration of perception. LSD played a significant role in the culture of the family. Psychedelic experiences could make the boundary between reality and imagination feel blurred. In an ordinary environment, a person might take LSD and eventually return to everyday life. But at Span Ranch, things were different. If a psychedelic experience happened within a group where everyone already shared the same ideology, Manson could become the person who interpreted that experience. You saw that because, you understand this because, that is the sign. And in this way, a personal experience could become evidence that seemed to reinforce the belief system of the entire group. But did Manson really brainwash them? This is a word often used when discussing the Manson family, brainwashing. But if we use that term too casually, we risk overlooking an important point. The family members were still human beings, capable of making choices. They were not machines. They could question. They could leave. They could refuse. They could resist. And some people did eventually leave the family. That suggests Manson's influence was not a form of absolute mind control. It was more complicated, a combination of isolation, dependency, belief, drugs, group pressure, and psychological manipulation. If the members were capable of making their own choices, were they responsible for what they did? Legally, the answer was yes, which is why those who directly participated in the murders faced punishment. But psychologically, the story is more complicated. A person can be manipulated and still be responsible for their actions. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and that is one of the reasons the Manson family case remains so disturbing. Manson wasn't always violent. The common image of Manson is that of a man who was constantly aggressive. But the reality was more complicated. Manson could be charismatic, he could be funny, he could speak softly, he could make people feel important. And that was part of what made him dangerous. Because someone who is always frightening is easier to recognize. But someone who can make you believe he understands me can find a way into your life much more easily. Music and the Hollywood dream. Manson wanted to become a musician. That was no secret. He believed music could help him escape poverty and give him the recognition he desperately wanted. One of the people he hoped could help him was Terry Melcher, a music producer with connections to Hollywood. But the opportunity never came. Manson was disappointed. And from there, theories about his possible motives began to emerge. Did his frustration with Hollywood turn into hatred? Was Cielo Drive chosen because of its connection to Melcher? Or was that simply one of many narratives pieced together after the murders? There was no simple answer. Point of doubt. Was Hollywood really the target? This is one of the most compelling theories. Manson wanted to become famous. He failed. He became angry. Then, he targeted a house that had once been connected to Hollywood. It sounds logical, but logical does not mean proven. Melcher had already moved out. Sharon Tate was the one living there. There is no conclusive evidence that Manson knew Tate would be at the house on the night of August 8th. And if Melcher was truly the target, the deaths of the other victims do not fully explain the motive. So, Hollywood may have been part of the story, but it is not enough to explain the entire case. Was Helter Skelter really a genuine belief? Manson talked extensively about Helter Skelter. The family members knew about it, and the words Helter Skelter appeared at the LaBianca crime scene. But did Manson genuinely believe that an apocalyptic race war would occur? Possibly. Did he use that idea to control the family? Also possible. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A person can genuinely believe something irrational, while also recognizing that the belief can be used to control others. Manson, madman or manipulator? This is a question the public has asked for decades. But madman is far too simple a word. If Manson had completely lost touch with reality, how could he build relationships, seek money, travel, persuade others, organize the family's daily life, and maintain his influence over people for years? He clearly had the ability to plan and adapt. But that does not mean he was free from extreme or unusual beliefs. A person can both manipulate others and genuinely believe irrational things. And that may have been the most terrifying part. Manson did not need to be a genius. He did not need a perfect plan. He only needed to find people who were vulnerable to influence and convince them that the outside world was the enemy, that the family was the only real family, that Charlie knew the truth. And then, once those beliefs became strong enough, even a small command could have enormous consequences. But in the end, Charles Manson still had to face the law. He was arrested. He was put on trial. And the case became one of the most famous trials in American history. But in court, Manson did not behave like an ordinary defendant. He did not simply try to deny the accusations. He turned the courtroom itself into a stage. He sang. He said bizarre things. He made attention-grabbing gestures. And the female members of the family openly displayed their loyalty to him. That was when America saw something perhaps even more disturbing than what had happened at Cielo Drive. Young women still loved and defended the man prosecutors accused of leading them toward murder. And one final question began to emerge. If Manson really was behind it all, why were his followers so fiercely loyal to him? Why were they willing to sacrifice their freedom? Why did they defend him? Why were they willing to face life in prison, or even the death penalty? And, most importantly, what had Manson done to turn ordinary people into killers? The answer would emerge inside the courtroom, where Manson was not only being judged for the deaths, but also for the power he had gained over other human beings. The trial. Was Manson the man behind it all, or just a bystander? Los Angeles, 1970. Nearly a year after the horrific nights of August 1969, Charles Manson walked into the courtroom. No more Span Ranch. No more dusty roads. No more family members gathered around him. No more long nights of drugs, music, and apocalyptic prophecies. This time, Manson stood before something he could not control with his words. The law. A trial like nitrogen monoxide, other. From the very beginning, the case attracted enormous media attention. Manson was not a mafia boss, not a bank robber, not a conventional serial killer. He was a small, thin man with long hair, surrounded by a group of young followers willing to defend him. The man facing Manson in court was prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. Bugliosi understood that he was not simply prosecuting the people who had directly carried out the killings. He had to prove that Manson, a man who was not physically present during every murder, was still the central figure behind them. And to do that, Bugliosi built a narrative known as Helter Skelter. According to the prosecution's theory, Manson believed that America was heading toward a race war. He called it Helter Skelter, a massive period of chaos. Black and white Americans would turn against one another. Society would collapse. But Manson believed the family would survive. They would retreat into the desert. And when the conflict was over, Manson and his followers would emerge as the rulers of a new world. To accelerate that process, the murders had to happen, and the crime scenes had to be staged in a way that would make others believe that the killers were black. This was an extremely powerful theory, because it appeared to explain so many details. Why there were multiple victims, why the messages were written, why the word pig appeared, and why members of the family continued killing after Cielo Drive. But even a powerful theory still had to confront one crucial question. Where was the direct evidence? The witnesses take the stand. The trial began, calling people who had once been inside the family to the witness stand, and one of the most important was Linda Kasabian. She described what had happened: the trips, the conversations, Manson, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Cielo Drive, and the La Bianca home, detail by detail. The story was presented before the jury. Kasabian describes the night at Cielo Drive. According to Kasabian's testimony, the group traveled to Cielo Drive. Tex Watson was the person who carried out the violence. Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel also participated. Kasabian remained outside and did not directly kill the victims, but she witnessed what happened afterward. Her testimony helped the prosecution reconstruct the sequence of events. What made her account particularly significant was that Kasabian did not try to portray herself as completely innocent. She admitted that she was there. She admitted that she had gone with the group, but she maintained that she did not participate in the killings. That distinction became one of the reasons her testimony carried so much weight. But the defense wasn't going to let her off easy. A witness who had been granted immunity was an obvious target for the defense. They could ask, "Are you telling the truth? or are you trying to save yourself? If Kasabian was facing prison time, but received immunity in exchange for her cooperation, then she clearly had a reason to work with the prosecution, and if her testimony was wrong, the entire prosecution's narrative could begin to unravel. But Bugliosi had one major advantage. He was not relying on Kasabian alone. Other testimonies were beginning to emerge as well. Susan Atkins was a particularly important figure. She had once been one of Manson's closest followers, and her testimony also helped connect Manson to the murders. Atkins described what had happened at Cielo Drive, the events involving Sharon Tate, the other victims, and the way the family operated. But Atkins's testimony also had a complicated history. She had previously told different versions of events to other people. Some details changed, and some accounts differed over time. So, just like Kasabian's testimony, Atkins's statements had to be carefully examined and corroborated. Tex Watson. If Manson was the man behind the killings, then Tex Watson was one of the most important figures in proving that connection. Watson directly participated in the murders at Cielo Drive. He was also directly involved in the La Bianca killings. But there was a complication. Watson was not tried alongside Manson during the initial proceedings. His legal proceedings took place separately. This created a notable gap in the Manson trial, because the person who had directly carried out the violence was not standing alongside Manson before the jury during the most crucial part of the proceedings. An important detail: Manson didn't have to kill anyone himself. Legally, this was a crucial point. The prosecution did not necessarily have to prove that Manson personally killed Sharon Tate. They had to establish that he participated in the conspiracy, encouraged or directed the criminal acts, and possessed the requisite criminal intent for the charges. If those elements could be proven, the fact that he never personally held the knife would not make him innocent. But Manson didn't stay silent. Inside the courtroom, Manson tried to control the image the public saw of him. He sang, he spoke, he made bizarre gestures. The female members of the family openly displayed their loyalty to him. At times, they seemed to turn the trial itself into a stage. Manson wanted to prove that he was not the man the prosecution portrayed him to be, but the stranger his behavior became, the more he turned into exactly the image the media wanted: a mysterious man, a cult leader, a monster of California. Manson often told his followers that they did not need to listen to the outside world, they only needed to listen to Charlie. And that was what made the trial so disturbing, because if the prosecution was right, Manson's influence went far beyond words. It had reached a point where some people were willing to kill to prove their loyalty to him. A shocking scene. During the trial, the female members of the family repeatedly displayed their loyalty to Manson. They laughed, they sang, they defended him, and they made gestures that drew attention. To the public, it was difficult to understand. How could a man accused of being behind a series of murders still have young people who loved him and stood by him? But this was the nature of psychological power. A person could inspire fear in outsiders, while simultaneously creating a sense of safety and belonging for those on the inside. At this point, we need to return to the central question. Was helter-skelter really the motive? Or did Bugliosi construct a compelling narrative that connected the evidence into one story? Manson talked about helter-skelter, the family knew about it, and a related message appeared at the La Bianca crime scene. But how much of the murders was actually planned around helter-skelter remains a question where we must distinguish between evidence and interpretation. Perhaps there was more than one motive at work. Power, as Manson sought control over the family. Fame, as he wanted recognition. Frustration with Hollywood, after his ambitions in music failed. Extreme beliefs, as he became convinced that the world was collapsing. And drugs and isolation, which pushed the members further away from the outside world. And ultimately, there was obedience. One man gave the direction, others carried it out. But the prosecution had to prove one crucial thing. Manson was not simply a man who said disturbing or irrational things. He had to be criminally responsible for what happened. That was the line between an eccentric man and a mastermind. Bugliosi tried to cross that line using testimony from people inside the family, Kasabian, Atkins, other witnesses, and physical evidence. Piece by piece, the evidence was placed before the jury. The defense tried to tear apart the prosecution's narrative. If Manson did not personally kill anyone, did he really give the orders? If the members acted on their own, could Manson still be held responsible? If Kasabian had been granted immunity, could her testimony truly be trusted? And if Helter Skelter was only an idea, was it enough to establish a motive? These were not unreasonable questions, but the jury had to evaluate the evidence as a whole, not one isolated detail. And then, after months of testimony and arguments, the trial finally reached its conclusion. The jury had to make a decision. There would be no more media frenzy, no more sensational stories, no more theories, only evidence, testimony, and the law. And the fate of Charles Manson and the members of the family. The verdict. In 1971, Charles Manson was convicted of charges related to the Tate and LaBianca murders. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Charles Tex Watson were also convicted for their roles in the killings. Initially, they were sentenced to death. But after California abolished the death penalty in 1972, their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole, subject to California law. Did Manson lose? Legally, it seemed that way. But in terms of his public image, the story was far more complicated. Manson became a cultural symbol. His name appeared in books, films, documentaries, podcasts, studies of cults, and research into psychological manipulation. And every time people revisit the murders of 1969, the name Charles Manson inevitably comes up. But the story was not over. A court verdict could establish legal responsibility, but it could not answer every historical question. It could not fully explain what was going on inside Manson's mind, how deeply he truly believed in Helter Skelter, why Sharon Tate became a target, why the LaBianca home was chosen, or why some members were willing to sacrifice their lives for him. And most importantly, is everything we think we know about Charles Manson actually accurate? One of the greatest paradoxes. Manson was convicted, but he never gave a single explanation that everyone could accept. He changed his story. Sometimes he denied things. Sometimes he spoke in vague terms. And at times, he seemed to deliberately create confusion. As a result, part of the story would remain in the shadows. Perhaps forever. Perhaps the prosecution was right about most of the bigger picture. Manson may indeed have manipulated the family and pushed them toward violence, but it is also possible that some details of his motives were simplified to turn an extremely complicated story into an explanation that was easier to understand. Charles Manson wanted Helter Skelter, and that is precisely why the case continues to be debated. After the trial, Manson did not die immediately after his conviction. He would spend nearly half a century within California's prison system. During that time, the outside world changed completely. The people who had once lived in the family grew old. Hollywood changed. Span Ranch disappeared. CeeLo Drive changed. The investigators who had worked the case eventually retired, and some passed away. But the name Manson remained. And this may be the most disturbing part. Manson did not need to kill anyone himself to become a lasting symbol. The story surrounding him was powerful enough to outlive the very people who created it. But when we look back at the entire case, one final question still remains. Not, was Charles Manson a bad person? That is far too easy to answer. The real question is, why did young people follow him to the point of being willing to kill? And the answer does not lie solely in Manson. It lies in America itself. In 1969, A generation losing its sense of direction. A deeply divided society. Drugs, war, violence, the counterculture movement, and young people searching for somewhere to belong. Manson only had to appear at the right time. Manson's legacy. Truth, myth, and questions that remain unanswered. Nearly 6 decades have passed. The summer of Ijolutu has become history. The streets of Los Angeles have changed. Hollywood has changed. America has changed. But there is one name that still makes people stop and listen whenever they hear it. Charles Manson. Cielo Drive. Is nitrogen monoxide longer the same? The house at 10,050 Cielo Drive, where Sharon Tate once lived, no longer exists as it did in 1969. The property has changed over the decades, but even though the house itself is gone, the memory remains. Because in the history of American crime, some places become symbols, not because of their architecture, and not because of their beauty, but because of what happened there. Cielo Drive is one of them. The people who died. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger, Stephen Parent, Leno LaBianca, Rosemary LaBianca. 7 people. 7 lives. And if we focus only on the name Charles Manson, it is easy to forget the most important thing. They were not characters in a movie. They were real people. They had families, friends, dreams, and plans for the future. They had tomorrows that they would never get to see. Sharon Tate was more than just a Manson victim. For decades, Sharon Tate has often been defined by a single story. The actress murdered by the Manson family. But Sharon Tate was so much more than that. She was an actress, building her career, a wife, a friend, and in the summer of 1969, a woman waiting for the birth of her first child. Remembering her life, rather than focusing only on her death, is a way of putting the victims back at the center of the story. Not Manson, not the family, but the people who were lost. And then comes the irony. Charles Manson, a man who did not personally kill all the victims, became far more famous than many of the people whose deaths he was convicted of being involved in. His name became a brand, a symbol of the murderous cult. Meanwhile, many people remember Sharon Tate simply as the woman murdered by Manson. It is a painful paradox. The person associated with the crime can sometimes become more famous than the people whose lives were taken. Manson is dead. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died in a California hospital. He had spent nearly half a century behind bars after his conviction. But Manson's death did not end the story. Instead, it sparked a new wave of interest. Books were republished. Documentaries were released. Podcasts revisited the case. Researchers continued to analyze it. And younger generations, people born decades after the murders, still know the name Manson. That is the strange power of a case like this. Why is Manson still famous? Perhaps because he represents a very deep fear. Not the fear of a lone killer, but the fear that an ordinary person can persuade others to do the unimaginable. A person does not necessarily have to hold the knife himself to become the center of a tragedy. That is what makes Manson such a compelling case for the study of social psychology, criminology, and extremist groups. But is cult enough to explain it? Today, the Manson family is often described as a cult. That is not entirely wrong. But the word cult can sometimes make the story seem too simple. It creates the impression that the people involved were outsiders from the beginning. But the reality was, many members of the family were young people. Some had families. Some had gone to school. Some had once lived ordinary lives. They were not born to become killers. They went through a process, and that process may be the most disturbing part of all. But is cult enough to explain it? Today, the Manson family is often described as a cult. That is not entirely wrong. But the word cult can sometimes make the story seem too simple. It creates the impression that the people involved were outsiders from the beginning. But the reality was, many members of the family were young people. Some had families. Some had gone to school. Some had once lived ordinary lives. They were not born to become killers. They went through a process, and that process may be the most disturbing part of all. Helter-skelter, truth or myth? This may be the biggest question that remains. During the trial, helter-skelter became the center of the prosecution's narrative. But, decades later, researchers still debate how accurately that explanation captures the full story. There is evidence that Manson spoke extensively about helter-skelter. There is evidence that members of the family knew about the idea, and the words appeared at the La Bianca crime scene. But was the entire series of murders really carried out according to a single plan? Did Manson's motives change over time? Or did the people who actually committed the killings interpret his words in their own way? There is no single answer that can explain everything. Whatever the ultimate motive may have been, the Manson family committed murder. That is not a theory, not a legend, and not a rumor. The members were convicted. The evidence was presented in court. The victims were real. The crime scenes were real. The messages were real. And the families who lost loved ones were real. That is the foundation from which every analysis of this case must begin. What about the other cases? After Manson was arrested, people began asking, could the family have been connected to other murders? Over the decades, many unsolved cases have been linked to Manson. But this is where we have to be extremely careful. An unsolved case does not mean the Manson family was responsible. A body discovered in California does not automatically connect it to Span Ranch. And a person who disappeared in 1969 does not automatically make them a Manson victim. There are theories worth investigating. But there are also many stories built on little more than coincidence. And once a figure becomes a legend, it becomes very easy to attach every unexplained mystery to their name. This is the point where legend begins to overshadow the truth. There is something unique about the Manson case. We know a great deal, but we still do not know everything. We know who was killed, who was convicted, who was involved, and broadly, how the murders unfolded. But Manson's exact motives can never be completely verified. No one can open his mind and know for certain what was truly happening inside it. Did Manson truly believe in helter-skelter? Possibly. Did he use it to manipulate others? Very likely. Did he want fame? Clearly, he craved recognition. Did he resent Hollywood? There is evidence of his frustration with the music industry. Was Sharon Tate a personal target? This remains something that should not be stated with certainty without direct evidence. Were all the murders part of one single master plan? There is no reason to reduce such a complicated case to one absolute answer. So who was Charles Manson, really? Perhaps. There is no single answer. He was a criminal from an early age, a man capable of manipulation, a leader who exerted enormous influence over vulnerable young people, a man who built a bizarre ideology, a man searching for fame, and a man convicted in connection with horrific murders. But at the same time, Manson was also a product of a deeply turbulent era. That does not excuse him. It only helps us understand how such a story could happen. The summer of Ijoludu, go back to Los Angeles. A city filled with lights. Cars moving along Sunset Boulevard. Recording studios. Hollywood parties. Young people searching for freedom. And somewhere outside the city, a group of people lived at Span Ranch. They sang. They used drugs. They talked about love. They talked about the future. They talked about the end of the world. No one outside knew that. One of the men living there would become one of the most infamous names in the history of American crime. The night of August 8th. A car drove up Cielo Drive, a gate, a house. An 18-year-old young man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then, sounds, footsteps, violence, and a family lost a mother before her child was ever born. The night of August 9. Another house, another couple, no Hollywood, no flashing lights, just an ordinary family, caught in a war they never knew they were part of. And then, America woke up, but the world had changed. The Manson case became one of the defining symbols of the late 1960s. It shattered the romantic image of an era defined only by peace, love, and music. Because behind the music festivals, violence still existed. Behind the promise of freedom, there could be manipulation. And behind a seemingly peaceful community, there could be one person determined to control everyone around him. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the case is not the name Manson. It is the lesson about power. A person does not need a gun, an army, or money. All they need is to convince a group of people that he knows the truth. And once they stop questioning, things can go very far. But this story should not end with Charles Manson. It should end with the people who died. Sharon, Jay, Abigail, Wojciech, Stephen, Leno, Rosemary. 7 names, 7 lives, 7 stories that no one could ever continue. Because when a crime becomes a legend, the easiest thing to happen is for us to remember the killer and forget the victims. Nearly 6 decades have passed. Spahn Ranch is gone. The people who once lived there have grown old. Some have died. Charles Manson is gone too. But the question remains, not what kind of monster was Manson, but what makes ordinary people believe in someone so completely that they become willing to kill for him. Perhaps that is the most frightening question of the entire case. Because Manson was not the only person in history to understand how to manipulate others. And the Manson family was not the last group to show just how far people can be pushed when they lose the ability to question. One night in Los Angeles, a house on a hill, a few words written on a wall, and one name, Charles Manson. But behind that name were 7 people who lost their lives. A generation left haunted, an America left shaken, and a story that, nearly 6 decades later, still refuses to fall silent. Because sometimes, the most frightening thing is not a killer. It is the ability of one human being to make others believe that killing is something they must do.